So was the Buddha bald? It's actually a more interesting question than you might think. We'll answer it coming up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in helping to promote a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled world, consider subscribing to the channel. So what we're dealing with here on this channel is early Buddhism, secular Buddhism, that kind of approach. And one aspect of Buddhism is iconography, and it's one of the things that we see Buddha images a lot. There's lots of interesting history about Buddhist iconography, and we're going to get into a little bit of that today. So was the Buddha bald? At first glance, it seems like an easy question to answer because we've seen so many icons or images of the Buddha with hair. I'll just pick one up here. This is from a recent show at the Met a few years ago. And we can see lots of hair up here, a little bump on the top, which we'll discuss either today or in a future video, but in any event, seems pretty obvious. And this kind of iconography began relatively early on, back in the Gandhara period or even earlier. And I can show you an image from Gandhara, an early image from the Gandhara period, probably 1st century of the Common Era. Maybe early 2nd century. Here you see the image. It's a bronze, and you can see again, full head of hair. Looks like he's got a kind of a top knot on that's pulling his hair up into a bun over his head. This eventually developed into the bump that we see later on. And so again, seems like we've answered the question. It seems like the answer is that the Buddha had a lot of hair. And part of we might want to consider, where does this idea come from that the Buddha had a full head of hair? And it seems to come from a certain sutta in the old in the Nikayas, the oldest group of suttas that we have. It's a sutta in the Digha Nikaya called the Marks of a Great Man. This sutta on the marks of a great man included a list of 32 sort of strange, unusual, or auspicious marks that were supposed to differentiate the Buddha's physical form from the physical form of other people around him. And in that regard, it was probably an example of we might call devotional or hagiographic literature that probably came up well after the Buddha's lifetime. It was written or composed by people who had not seen him personally, but who supposed or expected that he would have looked different. And there's an even later text, which includes even more marks, the additional sort of minor marks of a great man, additional 80 of these. And there we explicitly do find reference to hair, a number of different references to the Buddha's hair. And one of these references is that the Buddha's top knot, that he had a top knot, and it was shaped like a crown, or like a crown of flowers. And to an extent, we may wonder why it was particularly important that the Buddhas had hair, and that he had hair that looked a certain way, that was dark colored and so on. And what's important here is the way that iconography changes, in the sense that in the early periods, they came up with an idea of what the Buddha looked like. In fact, they described him in various ways. And in the later periods, some of those descriptions sort of fell by the wayside and became simply standardized, and no one really knew the reason for them. So, for example, in this middle period where we have the idea of the top knot of hair, this kind of hair gathered into a bun at the top of his head, later on became what's called the Ushnisha, which I showed you in this a good example here at the top. It becomes what's described, I think, nowadays as a fleshy kind of protuberance on the top of the Buddha's head. Again, something that seems sort of supernatural, unusual, the sort of thing that would distinguish or might distinguish the Buddha or Buddhas in general from other people. But again, as we've seen originally, it probably started as the idea of a top knot, of a knot of hair at the top of the Buddha's head. So again, back to the question of why it was so important that the Buddha had hair, and had a lot of it, and dark hair and all the rest. Some of it probably had to do with sort of masculinity, but some of it had to do probably with the number of people coming into the Sangha at the time who were Brahmins. And for Brahmins, the notion of being shaven-headed was something of a problem. When the Buddha approached Brahmins in the early suttas, he was actually, and his followers, his monastics, were were typically derided as being shaven-headed. There was a negative term which we don't really have comparable in English, but we might say it's sometimes translated as shavelings, as a sort of a negative term for being shaven-headed. That was how Brahmins at the time derided the Buddha and derided the Buddha's followers. We see this in the Ambatta Sutta of the Digha Nikaya, and we see this in a couple of suttas in the Sutta Nipata, where the Buddha is, again, is spoken down to as being somebody without hair, who's shaven his head. And that, for a Brahmin, is very negative, because the hair in Brahminic culture, in Brahminic society, the hair was considered a very special thing, and you didn't shave it off. So what we have here in this later hagiographic or devotional tradition is more of a sense of the Buddha having what we might call auspicious physical characteristics. And since in the Brahminic society, being shaven-headed or bald was not auspicious, he was generally portrayed, at least again in these later texts, as having hair. He was also portrayed as having a number of other physical characteristics that distinguished him from ordinary humans. Having wheels on the soles of his feet, having potentially webbed fingers, and a number of other weird and unusual kinds of characteristics. However, there are also two very famous suttas in the early tradition where it's pretty clear that the Buddha did not look unusual or different from other of the monastics around him. In particular, in the Samanyaphala Sutta, which is an early sutta, Digha Nikaya 2, there's a king who comes up and wants to meet the Buddha. And he sees a mass of monks, including the Buddha, and doesn't know how to distinguish the Buddha from the rest of the monks. So he asks somebody, please tell me who the Buddha is, because I don't know which of these people is the Buddha. And again, if the Buddha had particular special marks that distinguished him from the other monastics, or if he had a full head of hair where the monastics were all shaven-headed, it would have been easy to distinguish him from everybody else. But this text says it was not. Similarly, in the Dhatu Vibhanga Sutta, we have an example where the Buddha spent the whole night in meditation with one of his followers who had never met him, who was a follower from afar. And they spent the night in discussion and meditation, and at the end of the night, the Buddha revealed to him, yes, I am Siddhartha Gautama, I am the Buddha. And again, had the Buddha had these special marks, or had he been had a full head of hair, which would have been unusual for one of the Buddha's followers, it would be the kind of thing that would have, at the very least, initiated discussion and might have indeed sort of ended that sutta at the beginning, because the person would have been able to recognize him immediately. So the upshot of all of this is that the Buddha almost certainly was bald, was shaven-headed. He was derided for that fact by Brahmins at the time, which is something unlikely to have been made up by let's say, early monastic writers or composers, because that's the kind of thing you wouldn't want to portray your leader as having had happened to him. So he was almost certainly shaven-headed. Later on, the tradition, the notion of shaven-headedness was not considered auspicious, perhaps, and so therefore his iconography changed, with a number of sort of wholesale changes in the Buddha's iconography, making him more of a godlike figure and less of a human figure. So this is perhaps what might seem in the scheme of things a relatively small point about Buddhist iconographic history, but I think it does teach us both, on the one hand, that iconography does change with time, and that we can't assume that since icons look a certain way, that therefore the people who were supposedly portrayed in the icons look that way. Of course, we know this with Jesus, usually being portrayed as a blonde guy with a beard. But, in the Buddha's case, there are specific issues. Also, I think it reveals the ways in which devotional iconography can change the picture that we have of somebody from the ancient world. When they're presented in the later tradition as being greater than they actually were, as being different, as being more auspicious, in a sense trying to sort of pump up the aspects of their character or their physical being that at the time might have seemed more usual, more ordinary, or less liable to comment. So I hope this has been a useful discussion for you and might help spur some thoughts the next time you go and see Buddhist statues or go to a museum and see some Buddhist artwork. And let me know if you have any comments and questions. Thanks so much for your comments and questions in the past. I look forward to hearing some new comments, some new questions you guys have. Feel free to answer them yourself, or I'll try to get around to them when I can. And yeah, so thanks so much for watching, and we'll catch you on the next video. Bye-bye.